Right, we've got about half an hour to talk about the third and most, if you like, immediate elements of the crisis in capitalism, which is the crisis of the single currency area, the Eurozone. Gideon, is this a crisis of what at root is the cause of this crisis? Is it policymakers and their stupidity at jumping into something which doesn't work and never would have worked? The private sector for lending money willy-nilly without realizing that Greece isn't, in fact, Germany? Or something else?
Well, I fear that the crisis is actually to do with the single currency. And so that having created a common currency without a common government, that's the root of the dilemma. And that therefore, all this kind of pressure on Germany to build a bigger firewall or just agree to Eurobonds, etc., although there's an enormous amount of it, I do feel a bit, unfashionably perhaps, sympathetic towards the Germans. I was just in Berlin, and they've just got a frightful bashing at Davos. Everyone from David Cameron to Tim Geithner had lined up to say, the Germans essentially have just got to write a bigger check. And you talk to the Germans, they've actually already put down 211 billion euros worth of guarantees for the various firewall funds, and they're now being asked to write even more. That's equivalent to 80% of their national budget. And I think they're understandably reluctant to do it. And similarly, on the argument of Eurobonds, essentially they're being asked to underwrite the debts of Southern Europe without any control of the spending of Southern Europe. And when there was a suggestion that perhaps that should be put into place, they were effectively called Nazis for asking for what seemed to me a perfectly reasonable suggestion. So the trouble is that if you have Eurobonds and fiscal control, essentially you're talking about a European polity. And I don't think we're anywhere near being able to get to that. And, you talk to a lot of economists, and certainly American economists, who don't really have a view of European politics, and they will say, well, obviously, you're just going to have to end up with a political union, and that's how this story has to end, because otherwise it's not going to work. But I just don't, from what I know of European politics, I just don't think we'll get there. So we're in a rather hideous dilemma, and I think although the Germans are still, if they have any culpability, it's essentially because they came up with this idea of the euro, and they're kind of stuck with it now. And I think there's a sort of horrible, sick feeling dawning on a lot of the people trying to sort things out in Berlin that this is the problem. And a German friend of mine who works quite high up in the foreign ministry said in a rather strange, Lovian moment, he said, "We have invented a machine from hell that we cannot turn off." And I thought that was a fairly good summary of the situation.
It is. Stephen, do you share that really slightly grim prognosis that they either have to do something that is a huge step on to political union that they're probably not ready for, or face horrible crisis in unravelling this egg that they've already scrambled? What's your take?
I think I agree, in the sense that we can't stay where we are currently. So there are two extreme choices. One is the political union choice, and the other is that the whole thing breaks up. There's a lot of debate about what would happen if the whole thing were to break up, but I think that what you would find is that you'd have a massive collapse of cross-border capital flows across the Eurozone. You'd have huge problems with solvency, liquidity. If you wanted to find one potential trigger for the next Great Depression, it would be the collapse of the euro. So whatever happens, it all looks incredibly difficult. However, I'm not going to be quite so sympathetic towards the Germans. I think that they suffer from a degree of economic illiteracy when it comes to this debate. If you talk to people in Germany and say, what are the secrets of your economic success? They'll say it's hard work, being competitive, ensuring that inflation is low, and ideally also running a large current account surplus, in other words, a trade surplus. And then you say, well, do you think all other countries should follow the German example? And I say, absolutely. You begin to realize that unless we start doing trade with Jupiter or Mars, it's going to be a little bit difficult to make the numbers add up. I think also that in the period prior to the crisis, not just the Eurozone crisis, but the overall financial crisis, it's important to remember that the imbalances in the Eurozone were not the consequence of those who borrowed too much, and I'm thinking here of the southern European nations, but instead it was a consequence of those who lent too much, those in northern Europe, and that includes German financial institutions, German savers indirectly. And the reason why I say that is that in the years in the run-up to the financial crisis, the cost of borrowing for Greece, Portugal, Italy, Spain, Ireland collapsed. It became easier and easier for them to borrow because the lenders became ever more generous. And the lenders always assumed they would get their money back. And that was a very, very rash assumption. So what we've ended up with is this huge imbalance. The creditors want their money back, but the ability of the debtors to repay has fallen, not because they borrowed too much in one sense in the first place, but rather because the financial crisis has left levels of income everywhere in the Eurozone much lower than was the case previously. Now, for me, there's something we'll have to change over the course of the next few months, and it could become quite nasty, even if there's an optimistic story at the very end of this. And that is that if creditors insist that debtors have to do all the adjusting, eventually the danger is the debtors will simply collapse. And when they collapse, the creditors will also be in trouble. Now, if you go back to the 1930s, there was a kind of almost a dress rehearsal for these kinds of issues today. And the dress rehearsal involved France, which was the equivalent of Germany today, being a major creditor nation. And it involved Austria, which was really the equivalent of the southern European nations today. Austria was under the gold standard, facing terrible difficulties, had to deliver continuous austerity of the kind that we see in southern Europe today. In the process of delivering austerity, it had a series of corporate failures, and it was threatened with a series of bank failures. The Austrians asked others for some help. The French gave them some help, and the Austrians, for reasons best known to themselves, decided to enter into a customs union with Germany. This was 1931, not the best year for the Austrians and Germans perhaps to get together into a customs union. But the consequence of this was that the French said, if we're going to do this, we're going to withhold the next tranche of the loan, because the French believed that as creditors they could dictate to the debtors how they should behave. The consequence of that, withholding that particular loan, was the failure of Credit Anstalt, one of the major Austrian banks. And the failure of Credit Anstalt today is routinely regarded by economic historians as one of the key triggers that took us from a Great Recession to a Great Depression. And the irony of the story in the years that followed was that the country that really suffered in Europe in the Great Depression wasn't so much Austria, it was France. Because as a creditor, it suddenly discovered that the debtors it lent to couldn't repay it. And that, I think, is the problem for Germany today, that although it's absolutely true what Gideon says about this whole issue about how much the Germans have to pay up in terms of fiscal policy and so on and so forth, whatever happens, they're going to have to pay a very large bill. The question is whether the bill is paid on an orderly basis or whether it's paid on a very, very disorderly basis.
Interesting, very interesting division. Let's get a quick comment from Anatol, Linda, and then we'll go to the floor.
Well, I agree with all of that. I think those were two brilliant analyses. I think Stephen's story can really be summed up in a single sentence, which is that a financial crisis is not when money is lost, it's when people realize that money has been lost. And that's basically what, the Germans have lost a hell of a lot of money over the last 10 years for exactly the reason that Stephen gave. They were falling over themselves to lend to the Greek government, to buy condominiums on the Costa Brava and so on and so forth. All these things are worthless, and basically the Germans are the ones who have to pay up. They made the foolish investment. They're in exactly the same position vis-à-vis the rest of Europe as the greedy rich bankers are vis-à-vis the mortgage holders in the US. And I think they've got to recognize that. The only gloss that I would put on it is that I think, perhaps contrary to Gideon, I think there's actually a fair chance that Europe will turn into a single state over the next 5 years or so. I think that is the only solution. If it doesn't do that, it's got to break up. So one way or the other, we're at a tremendously historical moment. But I think the willingness for among the countries or the people even of much of the Eurozone to accept some kind of federal government similar to the United States is probably much greater than people in Britain or indeed in America recognize, partly because the traditions of national sovereignty, of political sovereignty as opposed to cultural sovereignty, are not that strong in most southern European countries. Italy, Greece, Spain have not been independent countries for a lot of the last couple of hundred years. So I think the real problem is that there are two countries in which the traditions of national sovereignty are very strong, and they are Germany and France. And the question is, which of them is actually going to run a united Europe? And I think if the whole system collapses, it will be over that rivalry between France and Germany. It's got nothing to do with Greece, Italy, or Spain.
Well, whatever happens in 5 years' time, the problem is very, very bad right now. We have, and that is the unemployment, particularly of young people, particularly in those countries in southern Europe. Can you imagine finishing university or school and not being able to get a job anywhere? 4 years ago, the unemployment rate in Germany and Spain was the same. Today, the unemployment rate in Germany is not much more than 5%, and in Spain it's 30%. And that's the result of the fact that money can't be transferred from the rich countries to the poor countries. In any single nation state, the tax is paid by the rich areas, like London, and between 40 and 50% of that is distributed by the government to the poorer regions. And that's how a political nation state works. We don't have that in Europe. And if we have to wait 5 years, there'll be 5 years of massive numbers of young people unemployed. And that's something we can't, I think, accept. And therefore, I think we should, it's not up to us, but I think the 17 countries in the Euro should go back to their national currencies and allow themselves to become competitive again so they can start earning their way. Forgiving their debts and paying them money doesn't help. They've got to become competitive, and they can only do that by having currencies which they can devalue once they become uncompetitive.
Very brief, John. Very briefly, John. You can have a quick...
There are two wild, unrealistic assumptions in all of this, which are very widespread. The first is that the answer is political union. The second is that if only the Germans would get on with it and allow the issue of euro bonds and basically pay for it, the problems would be solved. Imagine for a moment we had political union. Imagine for a moment that Chancellor Merkel is not Chancellor of Germany but Chancellor of Europe. What exactly is she going to be able to do as Chancellor of Europe to deal with the problems of people rioting in the streets of Athens, with a general strike in parts of southern Europe that Mr. Papademos is not able to do in his office in Athens today?
She can pay their wages.
Right, the only thing she can do is refuse to pay their wages.
Or pay their wages.
Pay their wages.
Right, or she can pay their wages, right, which is pretty good news, not just in Greece, it's good news in Portugal, in Spain, in Italy, in every other country of the European Union as well. This is just not going to happen. Even if people describe something as political union, that reality is not going to emerge from it. The second closely related fallacy, which is the one Anatole picked up straight away, is the one that says everyone knows what the answer is. It is that Germany pays. It's like us saying none of us are sure what we're doing for dinner tonight, but we can all agree what to do. Evan Davis will pay for it. We can all vote for that. There's just one problem, and it's an insoluble problem, an intractable problem, and that's the problem we have here. I'm sorry, but the problems we have in the Eurozone today do not seem to me admit of easy solution or probably any solution. And the notion that there are answers to be got, if only we would struggle towards them, is just a mistake and a misconception.
Quick comment from Linda, and then we'll have a couple of questions.
Just thinking a little bit about, there are a lot of difficulties for countries currently in the Eurozone. The reason why you hear a lot of these terms being thrown around, transfers, political union, is because ultimately a monetary union can only survive if it's what economists call an optimal currency union. So it's very simple. There's only two criteria. One is you share currency with countries you trade a lot with because you think there's a benefit to that you ought to give up your own currency for, making trade easier, crossing borders cheaper. But there's a second criteria, and this is where I think countries really have to look hard at whether or not they actually meet, which is convergence in incomes, convergence in business cycles. Do all these countries, can they really converge to the likes of Germany or the Netherlands? And just if they can't, then I think the issue is it really in their benefit to stay in the Eurozone? And I think that's the question which is confronting a lot of the peripheral countries right now, because we'll just take Greece as a quick example, although this could be a very long example. I'm just going to make it quick, which is that they do everything which is now asked of them by the European Union, the IMF, the ECB, and they will still end up by 2020 with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 120%. So that's austerity for another 9 years. And with rising unemployment, rising homelessness, the question I think it needs to ask itself is, should I stay in this currency union if ultimately I don't fit the criteria of an OCA? I think that's the question that all these countries will have to struggle with. And of course, the consequences, as we've all mentioned, are messy.
By 2020, it ends up where Italy is now, I think, is the good news for Greece. Let's take a couple of questions. We'll take one up there, but first we'll take one over here. Yeah.
One of the things that none of the panelists talked about was, what do you think the policy of the government in this country should be towards coming up with a solution for Europe?
Okay, that's a good question. I'm going to let Diane take that first, and meanwhile we'll get ready for a question up there. Go ahead, Diane.
Well, I think in this situation, it's hard for the British government to offer advice to the members of the Eurozone and be taken very seriously. But we have to recognise that our fortune's very closely tied to those of the Eurozone. It's our major trading partner. Our financial institutions very closely tied with all these trades that we were discussing earlier. And so we can't afford to be complacent about it at all. But I've been listening to this bit of the discussion, and it strikes me that nobody has mentioned the biggest Euro crisis of all, which is that these are countries whose demography is such that they're aging very rapidly, their populations will start shrinking, they're not innovating, and there's no growth. So these are countries of old people, run by old people, for old people, and it's no wonder they've got 25%, 30% youth unemployment. And given our own situation, again, it's quite hard for us to offer advice about how to grow the economy and tackle youth unemployment. We're all in that boat together. But those are the areas where I think all the governments should be focusing their attention.
We could invite the UK to join us, the Europeans to join the UK sterling monetary union.
The Irish might. But no, I mean, I think that the position of the British government, particularly the British Tory government, is very interesting on this because, of course, they were Eurosceptics. They didn't believe in the single currency, and half of them wants to say this single currency was a huge mistake and it should obviously break up. But every study they've had done for them by the Treasury tells them, don't do it, it'll be a total disaster. And so people like Cameron and Osborne, rather against their natural instincts, are urging the Europeans to go for political union because that's, they're told, is the only way to avoid the implosion of the European financial system. But unfortunately, as I say, I don't think they're going to get that either.
Well, following on from the question about the Austrian economists who predicted the financial crisis, perhaps they ought to appoint Bill Cash, our president of Europe, and he'd
that'd go down well.
Because they're the people who predicted the Euro crisis.
An orderly winding down a bit. Yeah, we'll take a quick one up there, and then where was the next one? I think we had someone over there, yeah.
Diane somewhat preempted my question, because what I wanted to ask the panel is we have heard nothing from any of you about where you think growth is going to come from, both for the UK and also within Europe. And I'd be interested to hear your views on where it might come from.
Thank you for that question. I'm going to park that, because in a couple of minutes to finish, I want to just whip down the whole line and ask you whether you think we will be richer per capita in 10 years' time than we are now or not. So that'll be your sort of final question. So where will it come from if we're going to be richer, or are we not going to be richer? In which case the answer is it's not going to come from anywhere. Where was the next one? Did I say the next one? Over here. Yeah, go.
Thank you. The latest Eurostat employment reports showed, rather unsurprisingly, a very large increase in migration from Southern Europe to Northern Europe, particularly youth migration. Isn't that ultimately how the single currency constructs a political union, by getting populations to move, by understanding each other's cultures, by intermarrying, etc.?
That's a very interesting point. I'm going to take another question straight away. We'll take one over here, and we'll let the panel pick up one or two at the same time. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, we've had allusions to morality during the course of this discussion. I just wonder, should economic systems be run as if a moral function existed? And if so, how should it be exercised?
Discuss. Okay. Okay, we've got two. We've got migration, morality. Let's take one quick one, and then I'm going to... Yeah, let's go back up to the top floor.
Hi, I'm Nico MacDonald. I wanted to pick up on the where will growth come from questions. Like most economic discussions around the crisis, we seem to have focused on the financial side of it. John Kay, to his credit, pointing out that circulating money between banks doesn't create value, and Sir Martin pointing out that we need to be more competitive. But it seems to me the root of the crisis is probably actually in a failure in the productive sector, which, Evan, your book was about, I seem to remember.
Indeed it was. I was going to mention it.
To your credit. And I do wonder, when we have an economy where even the most successful companies in the most successful sector in ICT, Apple, for instance, can't actually invest the billions of dollars it's made in profits in any new industries, markets. So I think the challenges we've got to answer is around greater productivity and innovation and actually creating new industries. So I think if growth's going to come from anywhere, we need to be focusing in those domains.
Do you know, I think
I'd like some answers there.
That's a very big and good question. And actually, I think we should wind up the Euro discussion now, because I'd like us to finish on time.
I'd just like to say just one thing about migration. If you look at what happened to Italy in 1870, they had a forced imposition of the lira over the whole country. Previously to that, they'd had many different currencies. Southern Italy was poorer than the north. They had one currency imposed, just like the euro, and all the people who were energetic and able and young moved to Brazil, Argentina, and northern Italy, and the result was permanent impoverishment of southern Europe, which exists today. And I think that's something we should note and not tolerate in Europe.
Right. Okay, panel. In a minute, starting with you, Thomas, we'll run down and we'll just ask you each to talk about where is the growth coming from and will we be richer in 10 years' time. And you've basically got 30 seconds.
That?
No, but just I'm going to ask you that. Yeah, yep. You're allowed.
Well, that's very kind of you.
That's
you
fine.
know, it's funny.
Before you answer that, Tom, because I'm giving you warning, so you've got time to think about what your answer is going to be. Let's just have a vote on the euro. We've had votes on the other two sections of the discussion. So the issue has been framed as a choice between moving further towards integration or towards moving backwards towards national currencies. And it's not a ridiculous way of framing the choice. The question for you is, how many of you think Europe should be putting its efforts into advancing towards political union to try and make the single currency work better? Political union on the one hand, or how many of you would rather they put all their efforts into working out a way of the least disorderly way of unravelling the thing and moving back to something that was less than a Eurozone of 17 countries. So how many of you think they should go along with the plan towards political union, whatever that means? And how many of you would say they should work out how to get out of this? Okay. Memo to Europe. Kensington tells you you're better off abandoning the thing. Okay.